So let's have this discussion now. The new members of the National Executive have taken their oath of office at the Union buildings. New Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana was the first to take that oath, followed by the Minister in the Presidency, Mondli Gungubele, and Dr. Phaahla, who's now replaced Dr. Zweli Mkhize as the new Health Minister. The new deputy ministers include Dr. Zomo from the Department of Health. Dr. Chanapilani Majake has returned to her role as the Deputy Minister of Public Service and Administration. President Cyril Ramaphosa reshuffled his cabinet on Thursday night. So what should you and I make of these changes? Well, let's bring in our guest to help us understand some of these issues. Senior Research Fellow at Trade Collective, Ms. Lebohang Pheko, joins us via our video line, as well as Political Analyst at the University of the Free State, Professor Sethulego Matebesi. To both our guests, thanks very much indeed, and welcome to the program. Ms. Pheko, I wonder if I can begin with you. How do you see these changes? Is this a people's cabinet, or rather a cabinet that will ensure the political survival of the president?
It's some people's cabinets, and I say that quite intentionally. I think that there are a few mediating factors that have led to this. The one is the general management and the mixed management of the COVID economy over the last 12 or 15 months. The second is the ongoing debates around the Zondo Commission and some of the findings that are emerging through that of course implicate key role players. And the final piece of that would probably be the recent insurrections or uprisings, protests, which were ostensibly emanating from the arrest of the former president Ndate Jacob Zuma, but of course escalated into an altogether different form of state insurrection or civic insurrection, giving rise to concerns of our state security machinery, mechanisms, and whether or not there's even coherence between the various wings or pillars of security, the police, the army, and the security services, in fact, and allegations that important intelligence was ignored or discarded by other parts of the security machinery, notably the chief of police, the minister of police. So I think in the midst of all of this, this is the context in which this reshuffle takes place, and also takes place at a time, and of course, in that President Ramaphosa is perceived in some corners to be in a tight corner, perceived to be unable to act, fairly ineffective in some regards, sometimes, of course, seem to be overweeningly concerned with external capital interests rather than the interests of, local business, local economies, and of course, our own well-being. So, yes, it's in this context, I think, that this reshuffle has taken place. How effective it has been is perhaps a discussion we can take further on in this conversation.
Absolutely. Before we get there, Prof, let's continue discussing the optics if we can. Cyril Ramaphosa initially said to have had a cabinet that reflected, call it a party united in some respects. In other words, it was a cabinet that appealed to the different factions of the ANC, initially at least. This change is said to be more aligned with his own presidency, attuned to, I guess, his control. Is that a perception you agree with?
Well, it's going to be very difficult to respond to that, but be it may be, a fact of the matter is the current crisis within the African National Congress will not suddenly be resolved just because there's been a change. I foresee a situation where this will go on as long as our leaders has aspirations to advance their own personal interest at the cost of South Africans. And I'm not only referring to members of the African National Congress. Yes, to a large extent, I think this now also puts tremendous pressure on the president to say, but he cannot come and say, but I inherited a cabinet. He has now chosen his own cabinet. He has made his bed, and he now needs to take the baton forward. And he now needs to take the word that he has been preaching. And to a certain extent, he has been doing quite well. The war against corruption, the war against indiscipline, not only in the African National Congress, but also among public servants. He now needs to take that to another level. There can't be any other complaints about that. But we have seen this before. We have seen numerous cabinet reshuffles, and the elephant in the room, lack of service delivery, a responsive local government, it's still sitting with South Africans. And we would like to see what is going to emanate out of this recent cabinet reshuffle.
Yeah, let's have that discussion then. There's a lot of, I guess, interest, understandably, in the new candidates introduced into this cabinet. Godongwana, there's been a lot of conversations around Dr. Phaahla. But what is to be said around the individuals who have questionable track records but remain in place? To what extent, Ms. Pheko, do those people compromise the ability of South Africans to see this as a cabinet fit for purpose?
So which probably links to our previous question around, for whose benefit and how efficacious is this cabinet for particular people. There has been a long-standing concern or complaint even that there is really a lack of sufficient rethinking and re-engineering around the cabinet. This notion of the chess pieces moving across the board, moving laterally across the board. And that's not only a complaint that comes with President Ramaphosa. I think he has actually taken it to the extreme, because the previous complaint with former President Zuma was that I think he subjected the country to about 9 cabinet reshuffles, some of them extremely abrupt, some of them very controversial. We remember some of the midnight shuffles where we suddenly woke up and there were 3 different finance ministers within a space of a week, for example. So I think he has tried to restabilize in that regard. But I think that at the extent of restabilizing, remember that he has also then had to deal with the slates. I think that the ghost of the slates from Nasrec are still have haunted the cabinet, not per se in the NEC, not per se in the cabinet per se, but across the NEC, and having to mediate those difficulties. And I think perhaps in some respect, not perhaps centering himself as somebody who has his people and is quite bold about having his people. Almost everybody, I think at least 3/4 of the cabinet, and I don't think it's productive for me to name names, has some kind of issue hanging over their heads. But I will mention that significantly, the new Minister of Finance, Mr. Enoch Godongwana, was at some stage dismissed as a deputy, from his position in the economic portfolio. It is a strange turn of events to see somebody of that caliber being recycled, as it were, or making a return, even though we're not entirely sure of what has become of those allegations. I think recently Mr. Zizi Godwa was also appearing before the Zondo Commissioner around some issues of financial probity and so forth, and he is now placed in an extremely strategic position as part of the key pillars of state security. And I think that all of these things really do point to the idea that this is really more about trying to keep the balance of forces rather than the fit for purpose, as you mentioned. And lastly, to say that there is a difficulty, I think, that we face in this country with the constant shifting around of people from one portfolio to the next. Just as a person seems to be finally getting the hang of the job, they are abruptly moved aside over, due to whatever cabinet reshuffle or political expediency, political games, and so on and so forth. And frankly, 5 years isn't even that long to become accustomed or acclimatized to a portfolio, let alone the 2, 3, 4 years that we sometimes see. On the same hand, we then see the elongation of particular people who have remained in cabinet positions. I think we see the Minister of Basic Education, Minister Andrew Motshekga, I think, who has been in the same position since 2009 and weathered many controversies, including missing textbooks, school books left in the rivers and floating down lakes late into the school academic year, and so on. So in terms of fit for purpose, Ayanda, I really think that that's the jury is very much out on that.
Yeah, and just to be clear, Enoch Godongwana back in 2012 actually resigned from his post as a deputy minister as opposed to being dismissed, but your point certainly well taken and well received. With that in mind, Prof, was this a calculated risk that the president had made here, or just, a sign of something he may have missed? Putting Enoch Godongwana as such an important post, a post that relies heavily on public perception, not only for the markets, but also for buy-in, for stakeholders who are involved in whatever discussions take place. Was this worth the risk, essentially, from the president's side, do you think?
Yeah, well, it is definitely, if you look at what has been happening over a couple of months in South Africa, or since his election, And you also take into consideration what happened in Nkandla, the incarceration of the former president, the protest thereafter. So this was not an ordinary cabinet reshuffle. You have a minister whom I regarded as one of those that at least has some sort of form of still credibility left, the former Minister of Health, Zweli Mkhize, also being implicated. And another one, we haven't foreseen that Tito Mboweni will resign. And I think if you look at all these, then definitely, I don't think the president just woke up and did consultation behind the scenes. He definitely had to take a very calculated step in terms of how his overall cabinet would look like. Because remember, we are not very far from an elective conference. And people always ask, why are we bringing in the ANC? Whatever happens in the ANC ultimately has a huge effect on how our government operates and the government processes. And definitely then the president also had to strike a balance between whether he's going to advance the interest of South Africans and whether he's also going to try and mute the so-called wounded grouping within the African National Congress, who I strongly believe behind the scenes, they are plotting the unseating of President Cyril Ramaphosa. We've seen some pronouncement, public pronouncement, where some leaders are dissatisfied with the leadership of the president. So he needed to take a very calculated risk. Otherwise, I think he would have exposed himself if he didn't do that.
Right. The Prof, Ms. Pheko, references Dr. Zweli Mkhize. I'm yet to find a conversation around this new cabinet that doesn't make reference to his saga. It was interesting to note, though, that the president, when he announced this new cabinet, not once did he say the SIU term, not once did he speak of digital vibes. What do you make of that? A missed opportunity? Or, again, another calculated risk?
Look, it could be a calculated risk. It could be also an attempt to avert from the conception or the perception that this was a personalized cabinet reshuffle, that it was really a move of technocrats trying to install the correct person for the correct position and to improve the optics indeed. And perhaps an attempt to really divert attention from that very unfortunate, suffice it to say, misdemeanor of Dr. Mkhize. I do also think, however, that in the midst of so many other things that are going on, it is also worth taking note that the securitization of the new cabinet and the centralization of the security cluster into the presidency, again, is really not coincidental, given the recent events of the last few weeks across our country. And I think that we need to really understand this in the context of a high-level commission that was chaired by Dr. Sidney Mufamadi, for whom hitherto there were absolutely no consequences. Of course, the names have been expunged in the public record, so most of us have not had access to the exact names that were implicated, although we can infer a few of them. But what seemed to be very clear was that to date there had been very little movement in that regard. And remember that that report was not only implicating a few key individuals, it was also a systemic analysis of judges and the judiciary who may have been influenced and swayed to make decisions in favor of a few key individuals. It also spoke to the notion that there is actually an increased desecuritization of our borders in favor of actually instigating or fomenting, instability internally. And it actually speaks to the notion that not all security is about international wars and so forth, but also speaks to the notion that as a country domestically, there are so many unseen and very discrete issues that are at play, which oftentimes, have a great impact on the way that we see the state functionality or infunctionality. It also spoke to the CR17 payroll and some of the judges who were alleged to have been on that payroll. So it is not just a report that speaks to the role of the army per se and the role of the security mechanisms. It also speaks to the interplay between the role of those mechanisms and political decisions that are playing themselves out in the public domain even now. So we should not see it as a coincidental tell that there's an attempt to now to centralize the security machinery into the state presidency. But of course, that for democracy, that for the rule of law presents huge problematics going forward.
Plenty to think about and plenty to consider. Let me thank you for your insights on this Saturday morning. I imagine we'll be hearing a whole lot more from both of you throughout the course of the weeks to come. Senior Research Fellow at Trade Collective, Lebohang Pheko, as well as Political Analyst at the University of the Free State, Professor Sethulego Matebesi. To both our guests, thanks very much indeed once again.